I wasn't in a good place that spring, and I knew it long before the ridge road thawed enough to stop rattling my truck apart. I was 58, with hands that still knew how to set a corner post plumb in hard ground, and shoulders that ached from pushing snow all winter. But none of that practical knowing did much for me after dark. I told people I'd moved back up to my mother's place to help out after Dad passed, and that was true as far as it went. The part I left out was that I couldn't stand the quiet in my own house anymore. A man can eat dinner in front of the sink, leave the TV off, and call that discipline for a while. After enough nights, it starts to feel like punishment. The property sat on a narrow ridge above the county road. 2 old houses and a machine shed with peeling red paint. 30 yards between my mother's porch and mine. Close enough to wave, far enough to pretend we were each doing fine. Dad had built both houses himself in stages, adding rooms when money came in from logging contracts, and every wall still held some mark of him. A line pencil drawn on door trim, a cabinet hinge shimmed with folded feed sack, initials scratched under the workbench lip. He'd been gone 16 months by then. Heart gave out in late October, quick and blunt. One of those phone calls that changes your sense of time into before and after, whether you like it or not. My marriage had been crumbling before that. Slow and tired. No dramatic scene. Just 2 people missing each other until missing became the main thing. By February, after Dad died, my wife and I were living separate lives with the kind of polite check-ins you use for co-workers. We did manage to keep things steady for our grown daughter when she called, and I'm grateful for that. But the house I rented in town felt like a storage unit for a man I didn't recognize. When Mum said, "You could come up here for a spell," I said I'd think about it. I had my truck packed 2 days later. Up there, I measured everything. Fence sections replaced. Driveway ruts filled, propane level. The weather report at 5:10 a.m., then again at noon. If I made it through supper without replaying the last month of Dad's life, I counted that as a good day. That was the real routine. Not chores, avoidance. I kept hearing myself in old voicemails. "I'll swing by next week, Dad. I'm tied up, but I'll call tomorrow." I had said those things because I believed there was time to spend. There wasn't. Mum, Lila, was 79 and still straighter back than me most mornings. She had a way of moving through a room that made everything seem deliberate, as if she were carrying a bowl full to the brim and refused to spill a drop. After Dad died, she kept his coffee mug by the stove for months. Not as a shrine, just there, washed and ready. Then one day it was on the top shelf with the extra canning jars, and neither of us mentioned the change. That was how we handled grief on that ridge. We rearranged objects and called it coping. We ate together maybe twice a week, usually stew or eggs and toast, and our conversations stayed on safe ground. Feed prices, whether the lower pasture needed liming, if the snowpack looked heavy in the north draw. One evening in March, sleet ticking against the windows, she set down her fork and looked at me longer than usual. "You sleeping any better?" she asked. "Some," I lied. She gave a little hum that meant she heard the lie and wasn't going to wrestle me over it. "You keep driving that plough route nights. You'll wear yourself clean out." "Work's work." "That's not what I asked." I looked down at my plate. "I know." She reached for the salt and then stopped, her hand resting on the tablecloth. "Your father used to say silence can be a tool or a trap. Depends who's holding it." I remember nodding like I understood something useful. Truth was, I felt called out and cared for at the same time, which is a hard mix to sit with when you're already tired. The winter itself seemed to side with the trap. Snow came late and stayed mean. Not dramatic blizzards, just steady systems that turned days into grey smears, and nights into long tunnels of plough lights and wet gloves. By the second week of March, the ridge had that exhausted look, crusted snow shrinking into dirty banks, old ice under fresh slush, every bootstep a negotiation. Crows that usually argued from dawn to dusk went quiet for stretches. So long I'd catch myself listening for them the way other people listen for a far train. I started calling it the long winter silence, half joking, but it was real enough to me I could have pointed to it like a fence line. It sat between houses. It sat at our table. It sat in my chest when I woke up before dawn and couldn't remember what day it was. I had one good companion through all that. Bo, my black and tan hound with a white chest patch shaped like a crooked arrow. Bo was 9, stiff in the hips, smart enough to fake deafness when a bath was involved, and loyal in that quiet dog way where he didn't demand anything except to be where you were. If I went to fix wire by the upper pasture, he went. If I checked culverts in freezing rain, he followed, snout low, ears slicked back. At night, he slept on a frayed rug by the wood stove and thumped his tail once when I came in, as if to say, "There you are." We made each other look steadier than we felt. Most mornings I woke at 4:45 without an alarm. Coffee, boots, weather radio. If roads were clear, I worked fences or hauled split oak from the lower pile. If roads were bad, I took the county plough from the shed and ran my route until noon, then came back up the ridge to check on Mum's generator and water lines. She never asked me to do those checks. I did them anyway because it gave me an excuse to knock on her door and hear another human voice before evening. Some days that was enough to keep the floor from dropping out. I told myself practical men don't spiral, they stay busy. Then I'd catch my reflection in the truck window, jaw clenched, eyes ringed purple from short sleep, and I'd think, busy is not the same as whole. I didn't say that aloud. I barely let myself think it. There's a kind of pride men in my line of work carry like a second belt. Hold it together. Keep moving. Don't burden anyone. It looks strong from outside. Inside, it can make a person lonely in rooms where love is already waiting. April came by inches that year. First, it was meltwater tapping porch rails in a steady drip. Then, mud opening in the ruts. Then, one afternoon of sun warm enough to steam the south slope. The smell changed before the view did. Wet earth and cedar bark and that cold mineral scent from the creek waking up. Mom set seed catalogues on her table, though she didn't order much anymore. I replaced 3 broken pickets on her porch and patched a leak in my mudroom roof. Ordinary work, hands occupied, mind spinning. On the first truly warm week, I carried a sack of pellet feed over to Mum's place just after dawn. The light was thin and clean, and mist lay low in the yard where the frost was lifting. I climbed her steps and stopped because there were flowers on the top stair, arranged in a careful fan like someone had set a table for a guest. Not daffodils from a store bucket, wildflowers. White trillium and little blue stars, I later learned, were bluets, stems trimmed neat and laid with intention. Mum opened the door in her robe, saw me looking down, and frowned in surprise. That looked genuine. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I was about to say the same to you." She looked from me to the flowers and back again. "Well, I surely didn't drive to town at 6 in the morning." "Maybe one of the church ladies," I offered, though nobody from church came up unannounced this early. She crouched slow, one hand on the doorframe, and touched a petal with her fingertip. "These don't come from town." We stood there in the chill, 2 people pretending this was simple. Bo came up behind me, nails clicking on the boards, and pressed his shoulder against my leg. Mom lifted the bouquet, carried it inside, and found a jelly jar for water without another word. I set the feed by her pantry door, checked her thermostat, and talked about rain chances like that settled anything. Back on my porch, I watched steam rise off the yard and told myself a reasonable story. Somebody passing through had picked them, maybe a neighbor kid trying to be kind. Maybe I'd forgotten some local custom Dad used to keep track of. The explanations lined up clean enough in my head, but my chest stayed tight in that old, familiar way. Grief does that. It makes ordinary tenderness feel suspicious because you don't trust gifts anymore, not after losing what mattered most. That evening, while the sky went from pale gold to iron grey over the spruce line, the long winter silence settled in again between the two houses. I could see Mom's kitchen light through her window. I could hear Bo breathing near my boots. I could hear meltwater ticking from the eaves like a slow metronome. 30 yards. That was all. 30 yards and a season's worth of unspoken things. I sat there until dark, with my hands around a cooling mug, aware for the first time that survival and living were not the same task. When the mug finally went cold in my hands, I stood up because staying put felt too much like giving in. Bo rose with me, joints popping a little, and followed me down the steps while I made a slow loop around the yard with no real purpose except to feel my legs working. The ground gave under my boots, thaw-slick and soft, and the night smelled like wet pine needles and old leaves waking up. Mum's kitchen light clicked off while I was near the shed, and for a second I almost called out to her through the dark, something plain like good night. But the words sat behind my teeth and never came. I checked the padlock on the fuel tank, checked it again, then stood listening to the ridge breathe in that thin way it does after snowmelt, creak noise far off, and branch tips ticking together above me. Inside, I laid out tomorrow's clothes on the chair by the stove, the same way I had for months. Shirt, long johns, heavy socks folded in half. Habits can look a lot like stability when you squint at them. I fed Bo, topped his water, and turned on the little lamp by the sink, not because I needed light, but because I didn't like the whole room dark at once. By 10:30, I was in bed and still wide awake, staring at the ceiling knot over my dresser where Dad used to joke there was a map of Texas if you tilted your head right. I kept trying to pray and kept ending up with inventory. Fence staples low, tractor battery weak. Call the hardware store for culvert bolts. Under that list, always, the real list. Call Dad back. Take Dad to lunch. Ask Dad what he meant that time about silence being a trap. The mind knows a dead end and runs there anyway. Sometime after midnight, I gave up, pulled on a jacket and stepped onto the porch in my socks like a fool. The boards were damp and cold through the cotton. I stood there until my toes went numb, looking toward Mum's place and the dark square of her window, and said into the yard, low enough I barely heard myself, "I'm trying." The next morning broke clear, pale sun through thin cloud, and I went up to the north fence line with a post driver and a coffee thermos while Bo quartered ahead, nose down in the wet grass. There was still patchy snow in the shaded cuts, grey around the edges, and every low spot held standing water that reflected the sky like sheet metal. I worked 3 hours without speaking, driving 2 replacements where elk had leaned the wire all winter, then sat on a stump with my gloves off, palms stinging, and watched steam lift from my sleeves. From that ridge shoulder, I could see both houses, small and ordinary from a distance, roofs damp and shining. It should have looked like home. It looked like 2 separate islands. By the second day after those flowers, clouds moved in and the wind turned raw again. I took the plough down for a county pass in the morning slush and got back around noon with grit in my teeth and my back barking at every bump. Mom waved from her porch when I pulled in, and I waved back, but kept driving to my own place first, a habit I'd gotten into when I didn't trust my face to look normal. Bo jumped out stiff and trotted to his water pan. I leaned against the truck fender longer than needed, feeling that old drop in my chest where fatigue and sadness start to look like the same weather system. Around 4, I carried over a split armload of dry oak and stacked it by Mum's stove. She had soup on, onion and celery, and something herby I couldn't name, and she asked me to stay for supper. I almost said I had paperwork. There was no paperwork. We ate at her small table by the window, each of us mostly looking at our bowls. Halfway through, she set her spoon down and said, "You remember your dad that spring he tried to graft apple branches and all but one took?" I nodded. He blamed the moon phase, then blamed the knife, then blamed the tree. She smiled at that, quick and tired. He just hated not being good at something on the first pass. Got that from him? No, she said, looking up at me. You got the stubborn part. He had more mercy for himself than you do. I let out a breath that turned into a rough little laugh. That's a sentence I don't know what to do with. You don't have to do anything with it tonight, she said. Just don't throw it away. I washed dishes while she dried, and we talked about seed potatoes like two people doing fine. When I stepped back outside, dusk had settled blue over the yard. Bo was waiting by my porch, sitting straight with his ears up but his tail loose against the boards. He watched the tree line past Mum's house, not tense, just attentive, like he'd heard someone pull into a driveway a long way off. I followed his gaze and saw nothing but the first rank of spruce and the old lilac hedge dark against the fading light. What I noticed, and kept noticing once I stood still enough, was the missing noise. Usually at that hour the jays complained, a pair of robins argued over the worm patch, and crows from the lower draw flew over in loud, crooked lines. That evening the yard held a soft, suspended quiet that was not empty exactly, more like a room where someone is sleeping and nobody wants to wake them. I told myself, weather does that. Pressure shifts, birds settle early, dogs key off your mood. I told myself all of it while standing there with my hand on the porch rail, not moving. Bo looked at me once, then back toward the hedge, then sat down again, as calm as church. No raised hackles, no growl, just waiting. 3 mornings after the first bouquet, I walked to Mum's with a quart jar of diesel treatment and found another fan of Wildflowers on her top step, fresher than the day before, stems still beaded with dew. Trillium again, bluets again, and 2 columbine heads just opening red and gold. Mum opened the door with her cardigan half buttoned, followed my eyes, and stopped. "Well," she said quietly, "there they are again." "You didn't hear anybody?" She shook her head. "I sleep light these days. Heard wind once around 3. That's it." I crouched and looked around the porch. Mud on the lower walk showed my own boot marks from yesterday, Mum's smaller tread, and Bo's paw tracks over both. Along the edge where the gutter dripped, there was one broad impression in softened soil, not sharp enough for detail, just a deep oval press with a long smear beside it, like weight shifting carefully. Too large for my boot, too long for any deer print, wrong shape for bear. I set my hand near it, not touching, and felt a chill run up my arms that had nothing to do with morning air. Bo came up behind me, nosed past my elbow, and sniffed that impression once. Then he sat down beside it and looked toward the trees, tail thumping one slow beat on the boards. "Bo," I said, because saying his name gave me something firm to hold. "What are you doing, buddy?" He didn't move. Mom leaned on the doorframe and watched us both. "He doesn't seem bothered." "No," I said, "he doesn't." She bent and picked up the bouquet with both hands, as careful as if she were lifting a bird. Could be someone trying to be kind. Could be. Her eyes stayed on the flowers. "You sound like you're arguing with yourself." Maybe I am. By the first week of April, I started waking before the alarm and checking her steps before coffee, like a man with a superstition he refused to admit. Some mornings there was nothing, and I felt oddly disappointed. Some mornings there they were again, laid in that same deliberate fan, never crushed, never flung. The stems were always cut clean. The varieties didn't match what grew near either house, which meant somebody was travelling for them in the dark and carrying them up that muddy grade without leaving clear tracks. I tried every practical explanation I had. Teenagers from town with too much time, a church friend making rounds before dawn, Mum herself setting them out and forgetting, though I knew that one was weak the second it crossed my mind. I even walked the lower road and asked my nearest neighbour, Clyde Renshaw, if he'd seen anybody parked by our turn-off at odd hours. Clyde squinted at me over his mailbox, cap pulled low. Nope. Why? Stray dog got into Mum's compost, I said, because I wasn't ready to hear my own story out loud. He grunted. I'll keep an eye out. I thanked him and drove off, feeling both relieved and ashamed. 3 days passed and no one called with a sighting because there wasn't one to report. What I couldn't fold into reason was the evening pattern. Right before dark, the yard would settle into that same attentive hush. Not dead quiet, not wrong, just orderly in a way wild places usually aren't. Chickadees still moved through the birch by the shed. A rabbit fed under the cedar and did not bolt. Bo would stand at the edge of the porch with his ears perked and his tail loose, then sit as if he'd received some signal I couldn't hear. I started sitting beside him on the top step, elbows on knees, letting the cold come up through my jeans while the sky drained from gold to slate. On the 7th evening, with a thin drizzle needling down and the smell of wet lilac bark in the air, I caught myself whispering, "This isn't real," in the same careful tone I'd used alone in my truck after Dad died, as if saying it gently might make it true. Bo turned his head and rested his chin on my knee. Across the yard, Mom's curtain shifted once and stilled. The ridge held its breath around us, and for the first time in a long while my despair made room for something else that didn't have a name yet, something quiet and steady enough to sit beside. I stayed on that step until the drizzle turned to a fine, cold mist and the porch boards went slick under my boots. Bo kept his chin on my knee like he was lending me his steadiness, and I sat there long enough to feel the old ache in my lower back start to throb. The feeling beside my grief wasn't joy, not yet, and it wasn't relief. It was curiosity, plain and inconvenient, the kind that keeps a man from finishing his own misery because he needs one more look at the tree line. I finally stood, rubbed Bo's ears and said, "Come on, partner," then crossed the yard with my eyes still pulling left toward the lilac hedge. Inside, I wrote 2 words on the back of an electric bill envelope and set it by the coffee pot so I'd see it at dawn. Trail camera. By first light, the ridge had that washed clean look after a night of mist. Every cedar needle holding a bead of water, mud dark as coffee grounds along the walkway. I carried Mum's paper out to her porch, and there was no bouquet that morning. Only her broom leaned by the rocker and the old milk can Dad used as a planter. She opened the door before I knocked, sweater buttoned wrong, hair pinned up quick. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't stay in bed." I handed her the paper, then nodded toward her garden patch below the porch. "I'm thinking I'll set a camera out by your lettuce rows. Raccoons tore up Clyde's starts last week." She watched me a second too long, then gave one small nod that said she heard the half-truth and was willing to take it. "If it helps, put one by the steps too. If somebody's walking up here in the dark, I'd just as soon know." "You're not bothered?" "I'm bothered by not knowing," she said. "That's different." She reached for the railing, looked toward the spruce, and softened her voice. "Whoever's leaving those flowers isn't stomping around to scare us, but I'm too old to pretend my eyes are better than evidence." That line settled in me harder than I expected. Evidence. That was a word I could work with. I spent the morning in the shed digging through bins until I found 2 trail cameras I'd bought years back for deer movement near the lower field, and never used much. One had a cracked latch. The other still smelled faintly of battery acid and pine dust. I cleaned contacts with a pocket knife tip, loaded fresh batteries, and tested both against the side of the tractor tire until the red indicator blinked clean. Bo watched from the doorway, head cocked, like I was assembling a puzzle he already knew the answer to. I mounted one camera on the cedar near Mom's garden, angled to catch the porch steps and part of the walkway. The second I fixed higher on a spruce at the yard edge where the lilacs met shadow. I kept telling myself I was doing pest control and property security, practical things, but my hands gave me away. I was careful in a way I hadn't been careful with much, besides ploughing ice. I checked sight lines 3 times. I cleared 2 drooping branches. I stepped out 30 feet and stood where a person might stand in the dark to see what each frame would catch. By noon, my jeans were wet at the knees and my coffee had gone cold in the thermos, and I felt more awake than I had in months. That evening, I made myself a proper supper instead of crackers over the sink. Venison sausage and potatoes fried crisp in cast iron. And after dishes, I pulled the camera cards like a kid, sneaking Christmas gifts from a closet. The first files were exactly what Reason said they'd be. Rain at 1:12 a.m., a possum waddling through at 2:07, Bo at 5:03, trotting by with a stick too long for his own dignity. I laughed alone in my kitchen, watching him clip the porch post and recover like nothing happened. Then fox, then wind, then my own tired shape at daybreak carrying split oak. For 3 nights that was the pattern. Ordinary animals, ordinary weather, ordinary me. Yet even that began to do something I hadn't expected. Reviewing those clips made me pay attention to hours I usually slept through in a fog. I started noticing how moonlight striped the boards, how mist pooled in low ruts, how often the same pair of jays arrived at nearly the same minute each morning. Grief had narrowed my world down to chores and regret. Now, against my will, details were widening it again. By the second week of April, I had started checking those cards every night after supper, even when my shoulders begged for bed. On the 5th night, I hit an interval that made me sit up straight. At 3:58 a.m., the yard looked normal, drizzle slanting through the frame. At 4:02, there was no rain visible, though the ground stayed wet, and every branch in view held still like the wind had been switched off. A rabbit sat under the cedar, ears forward but not tense. At 4:03, the rabbit turned its head toward the trees and kept chewing. Then, at the far left edge where the spruce trunks made dark vertical bars, something large crossed behind them in 2 measured passes, never fully exposed, just mass and motion. Not a bear's lope, not a man's stride. Too high through the shoulders, too deliberate through the hips, as if each step had been placed to avoid noise. I rewound it 6 times, then 7, bringing my face so close to the laptop screen my nose nearly touched glass. Pixel blur can manufacture ghosts out of rain and branch shadow. I knew that. I told myself that. I even stood up, paced to the sink, came back, and watched again with the room lights on. Same result. A shape, dark and broad, moving between trees with a kind of care that made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't sort. I wanted to call somebody and didn't know who I could stand to hear. Clyde would shrug. The guys from County Roads would laugh and ask what I'd been drinking. Mom might believe me too quickly, and I wasn't ready for that either. So I sat in my kitchen with Bo snoring by the stove and tried to reason it clean. Maybe an elk close to camera and distorted by angle. Maybe 2 deer crossing an overlap. Maybe me wanting there to be something because wanting hurt less than replaying old mistakes. That thought landed hardest. I had spent a year treating doubt like a shield, as if skepticism could keep grief from touching me. It hadn't. It had just made the rooms quieter. I told myself, this couldn't be real. Then I watched the clip one more time and found myself whispering, but it is something. The next morning brought low fog and a pale sun trying to burn through. I carried scrap lumber down to shore up a washout by the gate and came back muddy to the knees, cussing at my own shovel work. Mum called from her porch around noon. "Earl, you got a minute?" I crossed over, wiping my hands on my jeans. She held up the day's bouquet, white trillium fanned with little violet blooms this time. "I put these in water, but they're wilting faster today. Think the stems got cut too early." I looked at them, then at her. "You want me to move the camera a little wider? Might catch more of the walk." "That's your department." She studied my face. "Did you see anything yet?" "Not enough to call it anything." She gave a dry little smile. "Your father used to say men hide behind percentages when their hearts are on the line. I am not discussing my heart before lunch." That got a quiet laugh out of her, the first real one I'd heard in a while. "Fine. Then discuss this. Whoever keeps doing this knows plants better than I do." We stood side by side, looking at the bouquet like it might explain itself. Bo came up, sniffed the flowers, sneezed, and leaned against Mom's shin. She scratched behind his ears and said, "He trusts the world more than we do." That night, I shifted the spruce camera 2 feet higher and angled it toward the old stone well and lilac hedge where sight lines overlapped. I went to bed earlier than usual, worn out enough that sleep came quick, and woke before dawn to Bo standing beside me with one paw on the mattress, not whining, just present and alert. The room held that blue-grey light right before sunrise. I pulled on boots, grabbed my jacket, and followed him to the porch. Mist lay low over the yard, thickest around the well, turning fence posts into short black stubs floating in milk. The air smelled like wet earth and lilac bark. Somewhere down the slope a creek stone clicked under moving water. Bo trotted 3 steps down, then stopped and looked toward Mom's house. At the edge of her lilac hedge, half in fog and half in early light, stood a figure I felt before I understood. It was taller than the porch roofline at that angle, broad as a shed door through the shoulders, dark fur matted in places from rain, arms long enough that the hands hung near the knees. Yet nothing about it read as charge or threat. It moved slowly, angled away from the house as if to keep distance. One huge hand cradling a bundle of red and gold columbine stems against its chest. I froze with one hand on the porch post, breath shallow, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The figure bent at the waist with extraordinary care and placed the flowers on Mom's top step, arranging the stems with both hands until the fan sat neat and centered. Then it stepped backward once, twice, each foot set down with the same measured precision I'd seen in the grainy clip. No sudden turns, no looming, just room-making. Bo looked back at me, tail low and loose, then trotted across the yard before I could decide whether to call him. My whole body went cold and hot at once. "Bo," I hissed, too soft to stop anything. He reached the figure, slowed, and stretched his nose toward its wrist. The creature held still. Not rigid, just patient. Bo sniffed once, maybe twice, then gave a tiny tail wag and turned back, ambling toward me like he had checked the mail. He came up the steps and sat by my leg, breathing easy. And because my brain had lost every normal gear, I heard myself say, in a voice meant for strangers at a crowded hardware aisle, "Excuse me." The figure turned its head slightly toward me. I saw one eye clear through the mist, amber brown and steady, set in a face that looked older than any story I'd ever dismissed. Not human, not animal in the simple way I'd used that word all my life. Present, watchful, gentle. We stayed like that for maybe 3 heartbeats, maybe 10. Then it inclined its head once, almost formal, and stepped back into the spruce shadow without sound. Branches moved after it passed, then stilled. The yard returned to ordinary bird calls one by one, first a chickadee, then 2 jays bickering from the birch. I stood there in wet grass smell and thinning fog with Bo warm against my shin, trying to fit what I had seen into the shelves where I kept facts. Nothing fit. I wasn't panicked. That surprised me most. I was shaken down to the bone, yes, but underneath that was an odd, steady certainty. I had not been in danger. Mum's porch door opened with a soft creak. She stepped out in her robe and looked from me to the flowers, then to the trees. "You're pale as sheetrock," she said. "What happened?" I swallowed, realized my mouth was dry, and answered the only way I could. "I saw who's been leaving them." She held my eyes and didn't ask if I was joking. And I need coffee before I try to explain it. She nodded once, like that was sensible. "Put a pot on. I'll be over in a minute." I watched her lift the bouquet with careful hands, same as always, and set it in her jelly jar by the kitchen window. Then I walked back across the yard beside my dog, listening to the ridge wake around us, aware that curiosity had just crossed a line I could never uncross, and that for the first time since Dad died, the morning felt larger than my sorrow. I went straight to the stove, filled the kettle, and stood there with my hands braced on the counter while it heated, like if I moved too much the morning might fold back up and pretend it hadn't happened. Bo circled twice on his rug and lay down, but he kept his head up, watching the door. When Mom came in, she carried her jelly jar of columbine like she was carrying a lit candle. She set it on my table, took Dad's old chair without asking, and looked at me in that steady way of hers that had always made excuses feel pointless. "All right," she said. "Tell it plain." I sat across from her and heard my own voice sounding rough and small in my kitchen. "It was by your lilacs, taller than your porch roof looked from where I stood. Dark fur, broad shoulders. It set those flowers down with both hands, real careful. Bo went right up to it." I glanced at my dog, still calm as Sunday. Sniffed its wrist, came back like he'd checked a neighbour and approved. It looked at me, Mom. Not startled, not angry, just aware. She folded her hands around her mug and didn't interrupt. I kept going because stopping meant hearing how strange it sounded. I said "excuse me" to it, I added, and a helpless laugh escaped me. I actually did that, like it was blocking the cereal aisle. That earned a real smile from her, brief and warm. "Well," she said, "your manners held up under pressure." The kettle clicked off. I poured coffee, mostly so my hands had work to do, and sat again. Silence settled between us, but it wasn't the long winter silence, not that hollow kind that keeps people separate. This one felt like 2 people making room for truth they couldn't sort yet. "You believe me," I said at last. It came out more like a question than I intended. She looked toward the window where fog was lifting off the yard in pale sheets. "I believe you saw what you saw. I also believe we should check those camera cards while the batteries are fresh." That was Mom all over. Faith with a practical spine. We carried my laptop to her table because her kitchen had better daylight. I pulled both cards, one from the cedar by her garden and one from the spruce at the yard edge, and loaded the files while she buttered toast we forgot to eat. The first clips were ordinary motion and wet boards and my own shape crossing at dawn. Then the timestamp hit 4:12 a.m. on the spruce view, moonlight silver across her railing, and there he was. He came into frame from the left in 3 slow steps, each one placed with a precision that looked almost ceremonial. Massive shoulders, long arms, dark fur catching pale highlights where the moon struck it. He paused at the bottom stair and turned his head toward the rocking chair by her door. Just stood there for several seconds, head bowed, not slumped, not hiding, simply still in a way I'd never seen from any wild thing. Then he climbed one step, bent, and set the bouquet down with both hands, as if the flowers mattered as much as whoever would find them. He adjusted one stem, straightened, stepped backward off the porch, one measured pace at a time, keeping space between himself and the house. Then he was gone into spruce shadow without a snapped twig. Mum pressed her fingers to her lips. I realized I'd been leaning so close to the screen my shoulders hurt. We watched that same 42 seconds 4 times. On the 5th pass, I noticed details I'd missed. How the jays in the birch kept feeding. No panic. How the porch board barely flexed under his weight because he chose the joist line. How he never once looked toward the camera, either because he knew it was there and didn't care, or because he respected boundaries better than most people I knew. The crux of it landed then, heavy and clean at the same time. My disbelief had been built on the idea that anything this large had to be forceful, had to take up space without asking. What I had seen on the porch and on screen was the opposite. He made himself smaller in the ways that mattered. I remember sitting there with my palms flat on Mom's oilcloth table and thinking in a hard present tense that cut through every old habit. This is real. It is happening on our ridge, and I'm not being hunted. I am being trusted. The thought shook me more than fear would have. Fear I understood. Trust asked more of me. It asked me to stop treating the world like a list of threats and failures. It asked me to see what was in front of me without forcing it into the framework I'd used to survive Dad's death, the marriage wreckage, the long months of staying numb on purpose. I had called that toughness. Watching that clip, I could see the trade-offs plain as daylight. Numb keeps pain out, but it keeps wonder out too. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted the whole weather, not just shelter. Mom reached over and touched my wrist. "He's careful," she said softly. That's the word I keep coming back to. "Yeah," I said, "careful." She nodded toward the paused frame, his shape half turned in moonlight. Not afraid of us, but careful with us. By late morning, rain was forecast to turn hard by afternoon, with a cold front sliding down the ridge and likely sleet by nightfall. I spent early hours clearing the ditch by the gate so runoff wouldn't flood her steps. Bo stayed close, mud to his elbows, supervising in that serious hound way. Around noon, I had to run into town for fence staples and her prescription refill, and by the time I climbed back up the ridge, the sky had gone pewter, and the first drops were tapping on my windshield. I parked near my porch, grabbed the pharmacy bag and a sack of grain, and looked over at Mum's place. Something in the scene snagged my eye. Under her porch roof, where the wood should have been scattered and damp, sat 2 neat stacks of split kindling, bark side out, dry and squared. I stared long enough to make sure my tired brain wasn't inventing order where there was none. I had not stacked that wood. Mum couldn't have carried it herself in that volume, not with her shoulder. The storm hadn't done it. I set the grain in my mudroom, took the pharmacy bag and crossed the yard through fresh rain. Bo trotted ahead, tail swinging. Mum opened before I knocked, took one look at my face, and stepped aside. "You see it?" she asked. "The wood." She nodded. "Wasn't there at breakfast. I heard something around 11, like logs touching, but gentle. I thought maybe it was you." I handed her the bag and turned back to the steps. The top 3 boards were wet, but under the overhang the stacks were dry to the touch, each piece laid in alternating rows for airflow the same way Dad taught me when I was 12. Not random, not dropped. Built. Rain thickened, rattling the metal shed roof across the yard. At the edge of her walkway, where mud usually slicked up into a hazard, the surface had been tamped flat in a narrow lane from porch to gate, heel-wide and firm, as if someone with great weight had pressed and shaped it deliberately. I crouched and ran my fingers over it. Packed, but not gouged. Stable. It was exactly where Mum's right foot tended to slide when she carried laundry to the line. She stood behind me in the doorway, one hand on the frame. That path wasn't like that this morning either. I looked up at her and felt something inside me shift from astonishment to recognition. This wasn't display. It was help. Quiet, specific help aimed at the spots where our days got hard. "Let's pull the card now," I said. Back in my kitchen, rain drumming the roof, we loaded the noon files. At 10:47 a.m., the cedar camera showed the yard empty. At 10:52, he entered frame from the spruce line carrying an armload of storm-fallen branches held against his chest. He moved to her porch, set them down, and began splitting by hand against the edge of an old stump. Short, controlled motions, no wasted force. He stacked each piece under the roof. Then he walked the muddy strip and pressed it down with broad, careful steps, turning once to check the slope where water ran. He even dragged a flat board from beside the shed and laid it across the worst rut near the bottom step. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the porch for a moment, then the window, then retreated the way he always did, backward first, giving distance before turning to the trees. Mom watched with both hands around her mug, eyes wet but steady. "Your dad used to lay a board there in spring," she said. "Same spot." I swallowed hard. He couldn't have known that. "No," she said, but he could see what needed doing. We sat through the rest of the clip in silence. Bo sighed, flopped onto his side, and began snoring like a chainsaw with manners. The sound broke the tension enough that Mom huffed a laugh through her nose. "Your guard dog is useless," she said. "He's selectively employed," I replied. "He handles sandwich theft and morale." She shook her head, smiling, then grew serious again. "Earl, we need to decide how we're going to carry this. Town doesn't need every sacred thing turned into gossip." I leaned back, listening to rain and wind push against the house. "We keep it here. No bait, no chasing, no inviting folks up to prove anything. We keep cameras for safety. We say thanks in the only ways we can." She considered that, then nodded once. "All right." Sleet started around dusk, soft at first, then sharper against the windows. I walked Mom back to her porch with an umbrella we both knew was too small, and at her steps she paused, looked at the stacked kindling, and laid her palm on the top row as if greeting an old friend. Inside her kitchen, she lit the small lamp by the sink, and the warm square of it spilled across the railing where columbine stems still rested in their jar. I crossed back to my own house through a yard that no longer felt like two islands. It felt like a place being watched over in ways I didn't understand, and no longer needed to dominate with explanations. That night, I checked both door latches, set my boots by the stove, and wrote one line on a fresh envelope for morning, so I wouldn't forget the promise I'd made at her table. Leave room, return care. I set the envelope by the coffee pot, turned the lamp down low, and stood a long minute with my hand on the counter, listening to sleet hiss against the windows. The house felt smaller in that weather, every sound close, every draft finding your neck. Bo sighed in his sleep and twitched one paw. I should have gone to bed. Instead, I pulled on my jacket and crossed to Mum's porch with the umbrella, just to see if she needed another armload of that dry kindling. She opened before I knocked. Her cheeks were pink from the stove heat, but her breathing had a faint rasp under it, the kind you hear first and worry about later. "You all right?" I asked. "Just a little tight in the chest," she said, waving one hand as if brushing flour from the air. "Cold got in there. I'll steam and be fine. You coughing?" "Some." I looked past her at the table where her teacup sat untouched. "I can run you to urgent care." "In this mess? Earl, no, I'm not dying tonight." That landed sharper than she meant it to. I felt my jaw set. "Didn't say you were." She softened right away. I know. I'll call the clinic first thing if it's worse by morning. Go get warm." By dawn, the sleet had turned to a thin glaze over everything. Porch rails shining like glass rods, ruts frozen hard with water moving underneath. I checked on her before coffee. The rasp was worse. She had that tucked-in posture people get when breathing takes effort they don't want to admit. I called the clinic from her kitchen while she sat wrapped in Dad's old wool blanket. Nurse said what nurses say in calm voices that keep panic out of a room. Likely chest infection. Start antibiotic today. Fluids. Watch oxygen. Bring her in if fever climbs or breathing labours. She phoned the prescription to town. I wrote every instruction on the back of my envelope so I wouldn't miss a step. The road down was bad, but passable if you respected it. I ran slow into town, got the pharmacy bag double wrapped in paper, picked up broth and saltine crackers, then crawled back up the ridge with both hands tight on the wheel. By then, sleet had thickened again, slanting sideways in silver needles. I was tired in that bone-deep way where anger sits right behind your eyes waiting for any excuse. At the gate, Runoff had jumped the ditch and spread across the walkway to Mom's steps, a slick sheet over packed mud. I parked short so I could carry things by hand. Bo whined once from the passenger seat, wanting out, and I told him to stay. I grabbed the grocery sack and the pharmacy bag, took 3 careful steps, and my boot skated. I caught myself on the gatepost, but the pharmacy bag slipped from my hand and landed by the lower rail in slush. Not soaked through yet. I set the groceries back in the truck bed and went for the sand bucket and the flat shovel, muttering at myself the whole way. I was halfway back, bucket banging my knee, when movement crossed the far edge of my headlights. He came from the spruce line with the same unhurried precision I had seen on the camera, tall enough that the sleet struck his shoulders and split around him. In one hand he held the paper pharmacy bag I had dropped, tucked high against his chest under his forearm to keep it dry. In the other, he carried a small cluster of fresh violets, dark purple heads cupped against the weather. He did not glance toward me. He did not hurry. He walked the slick yard in measured steps, each placement tested before weight settled, like a man carrying a full pot over uneven floorboards. I froze beside my truck, sand bucket hanging from 2 numb fingers. My first thought was practical and ridiculous. He found the dry side of the bag faster than I would have. He reached Mom's porch, bent at the waist, and set the violets beside her door where she would see them first. Then he knelt one knee to the top step and nudged the pharmacy bag inward with the backs of his knuckles until it rested against the jamb under shelter. No tearing, no fumbling, just deliberate care. He lifted his head toward the window once, as if checking whether she was in sight, then backed down the steps in reverse, giving the doorway space. At the bottom, he paused, one broad hand resting lightly on the porch post, and then he turned and walked into sleet-grey spruce without one dramatic motion. The branches accepted him and stilled. I stood there until my fingers hurt from gripping plastic. Not fear, something older and deeper. A release starting in my chest like ice on a spring creek finally giving way. I got the sand down, got the groceries in, got the medicine to her table. I did every task in order because tasks were the only language I trusted when my throat was thick. Mom looked from me to the bag, then to the violets in my wet hand. "You dropped these?" she asked. I shook my head once. She waited. I set the flowers by the sink and sat down hard in Dad's old chair. Bo pressed against my leg, warm and solid. I could hear sleet tapping the window, the clock over her stove, my own breath trying to find a steady rhythm. What I had held shut for months, maybe years, broke open all at once, and not quietly. "I missed him," I said, and then louder because the first time wasn't enough. I missed him while he was still here. I kept saying next week, like I had a contract with time. And after he died, I turned mean in my own head. I called it discipline. I called it work ethic. Truth is, I was hiding. From you, from my wife, from everybody. I thought if I stayed skeptical about all of it, about anything I couldn't measure, then I couldn't be blindsided again. I thought that would keep us safe. It didn't. It just made this place colder. Mom had both hands around her mug, but she didn't drink. Her eyes were wet and steady on mine. "I watched him carry your medicine to your door," I said. "In this weather, shielding that bag like it mattered more than he did. He put violets down first." She closed her eyes for a breath, then opened them. "Your dad used to leave me flowers on storms." That sentence undid me. I bent forward with my forearms on my knees and cried at her kitchen table like a tired man who had run out of ways to postpone it. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. Bo put his chin on my boot. Mom reached across and laid her hand on the back of my wrist, exactly the way she had when I was 10, and split my lip on a gate latch and swore I was fine while blood dripped on my shirt. The crying passed in waves, and when it eased I leaned back, wiped my face on my sleeve, and laughed once at myself because there I was, nearly 60, snotty and red-eyed in front of my mother and dog. "Handsome scene," I said. Mum gave me a look that carried half a smile. "You always were a crier. You just took 40 years off." That got another rough laugh out of me, and something in the room settled. I heard my thoughts in a sharp present tense then, cleaner than they had been in months. I am not alone on this ridge. She is not alone. I am done mistaking silence for strength. I am done pretending care has to come in forms I already approve of. I don't need a theory right now. I need to answer kindness with steadiness. 3 days passed before the sleet let up enough to show ground again, and in that time we kept a practical rhythm. Medicine at 7 and 7. Broth at noon. Steam kettle by her chair. I salted the path twice daily and checked camera batteries because habit still mattered, but I wasn't hunting proof anymore. I was tending to what was in front of me. Mum's breathing loosened by the second evening. Her fever never climbed high. On the third morning, she stood long enough to water a spider plant and scold me for hovering. Late that afternoon, sky clearing to a weak gold over the spruce, I sat by the window with the laptop and ran the porch camera from the storm hour. There he was again in frame, exactly as I had seen from the truck, larger than the railing, smaller in his motions than any creature that size had a right to be. Set flowers, set medicine, check doorway. Back away, leave, no flourish, no claim, no wait for thanks. The withdrawal was its own language. He did not vanish like smoke. He simply chose distance with care, the same way he chose each footfall near our houses. Watching it, I understood that his kindness had boundaries built into it, and that was part of why it felt trustworthy. He gave what was needed and then returned the silence intact. That evening, when Mom finished her soup, she folded her napkin and said, "Set one more placemat tomorrow, by the window." "For who?" "For gratitude," she said. not company. I nodded because the distinction mattered. After dishes, I stepped onto the porch while daylight drained from the ridge. Bo sat beside me, shoulder against my knee. The yard held ordinary sounds again, robins in the lower birch, meltwater ticking from the eaves, far truck noise from the county road. Near the cedar, just before dark, a shape moved once between trunks, tall and unhurried, then passed out of sight without another sign. No demand to be followed, no test, just a quiet departure into his own world. I stood there until the cold reached my wrists, then went inside and left the porch light off, not out of fear, but out of respect for a kindness that had never asked to be seen. I went inside, hung my jacket, and stood in the dark kitchen until my eyes adjusted to the square of moonlight on the floorboards. The next morning, I carried one more placemat to Mom's table, the green one with the frayed corner she always kept at the bottom of the stack, and set it by the window where the light came in strongest. I put down a plain white plate, a folded napkin, and one of Dad's old teaspoons polished bright from use. No cup, no chair pulled out, just place and intention. Mom watched from the stove while oatmeal thickened in the pot. "That looks right," she said. "Feels a little foolish," I admitted. She gave me that side glance that had corrected me since I was 8. Most necessary things do at first. Bo stationed himself by the extra setting and looked at me like I had finally set a place for him after years of injustice. I pointed at his bed. "Not for you." He sighed like a man paying taxes and shuffled 2 feet away, then inched back when he thought I wasn't looking. For a creature with excellent hearing, he had a remarkable inability to detect the word no when apples were involved. After breakfast, we spread the camera cards, spare batteries, and my legal pad across her table and worked through every file from the week of sleet, not quickly, not hunting spectacle, just cataloguing what we had seen. I wrote timestamps in block letters. 4:12 a.m. bouquet and bowed head at the rocking chair. 10:52 a.m. kindling stacked under porch roof. Path tamped firm along laundry line route. Storm hour pharmacy bag retrieved and placed dry by door. Violets at threshold. We checked both camera angles against each other so there was no confusion about sequence. At noon, Mom fetched an old metal recipe tin from her pantry, emptied out index cards and rubber bands, and said, "This will hold the memory cards better than your glove box." I labelled 3 envelopes and slid the cards in. She watched me seal them and asked, "Are you going to send copies anywhere?" I looked out at the cedar, then back at the table. "No, I made one backup drive in case the laptop fails. It goes in the safe with Dad's deed papers. That's enough analysis for me." She nodded. Then that settled. 3 days after the storm, the clinic nurse called back while I was splitting oak behind the shed. Mom waved me in from her porch, cordless phone outstretched. The nurse asked about fever, cough, appetite, and whether the antibiotic was agreeing with her stomach. Mom answered in her dry, no-nonsense way, then handed me the phone so I could confirm dosing times and warning signs one more time. "You did right bringing her in fast," the nurse said before hanging up. That simple sentence took a weight off my shoulders I hadn't named. External world, plain outcome. No mystery there, and I was grateful for it. By the second week of May, the ridge had gone from Thor brown to early green, and I met Clyde at the mailboxes down by the county road. He leaned on his tailgate, cap low, same as always. "How's that stray dog trouble?" he asked. I considered lying again and felt tired just thinking about it. "No dog." He studied my face, then looked up toward our ridgeline. "Figured as much." "You did?" He shrugged a small motion under a canvas jacket. "My granddad used to leave apples by a cedar stump every spring. Said kindness isn't always human-shaped. I thought he was talking in riddles till I got old enough to stop needing everything explained." I stood there holding my mail, not sure whether to laugh or thank him. "You ever see anything yourself?" "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not. I never chased it." That was all he offered, and all he ever offered. The loaded look he'd given me that first week paid off right there in 10 quiet words and a family habit older than mine. On the first clear morning of June, I tied up a plain bundle just like I'd promised at Mum's table. A little packet of marigold seed, bean seed, and sunflower seed wrapped in brown paper, 2 apples from town, and a short note with no names on it. Only thank you for your care. I used twine from Dad's workbench and set the bundle at the base of the cedar before sunrise. Then I stepped back to my porch and waited with Bo. No music, no talking, no attempt to lure. Just a gift left where our worlds touched. The bundle was gone by full light. In its place lay a small spray of fern and 3 bluets arranged in a neat line on the cedar root, dew still on the petals. Bo sniffed once and wagged, then trotted to his water dish like the morning had proceeded exactly as expected. I remember standing there in work boots and old flannel, hearing my thoughts arrive in present tense with a clarity I had not trusted in myself for a long while. I am still grieving. I am still a man who missed calls he can never return. I am also a man being offered another way to live, one built on attention instead of control. The world is not safer because I deny what I cannot classify. It is kinder when I answer care with care. Strength is not going hard and silent until everyone gives up reaching you. Strength is staying reachable. Strength is setting one more placemat and meaning it. Later that month, my wife called about our daughter's move and whether I could help haul furniture on Saturday. We had lived in the polite weather zone for so long I could forecast each sentence before it came. This time I listened longer. When the logistics were done, I said, "I haven't been easy to talk to." A pause. Then, "No, you haven't." "I'm working on that, not as a speech, for real." Another pause, softer this time. "I'd like that, Earl." We still didn't fix our marriage in one call, and I'm not dressing it up as a miracle. But by August we were co-parenting our grown kid with less flinch in every exchange, sharing calendars without scorekeeping, speaking in whole sentences instead of clipped updates. That was repair enough to start, and it mattered. When October rain returned, Mom was strong again, cardigan buttoned straight, pruning shears in hand, bossing me around her tomato steaks like I was a seasonal hire. On Dad's birthday, we found asters and late goldenrod on her step before dawn, fanned exactly as the spring flowers had been. On my parents' anniversary in November, after first frost silvered the railings, there was a small bundle of evergreen tips and dried yarrow, tied with grass. We marked each date quietly. No announcements, no visitors. Just the 3 of us at table. One extra setting by the window, and gratitude that no longer embarrassed me. I checked the cameras once a month, as promised, usually on the first Saturday after lunch. Some cards held only foxes, rain, and my own bent back carrying feed. Some held those careful passes at the tree line, always distant, never crowding the houses. By the second spring, the flower mornings came fewer, but truer, only on the dates that meant something to us, as if the pattern had always belonged to memory more than season. In the third spring after the sleet storm, I set out seeds and apples under the cedar and found them untouched for 2 days. On the third day, I walked the creek path to clear storm branches and saw the marker near the sunny bend where water widened. 2 flat stones crossed cleanly over one another, balanced with intent on a mossed stump. No boot prints nearby but mine. No camera out there, just that simple sign at the edge of open light. I crouched beside it, hat in my hands, and stayed there long enough for the creak noise to settle inside me. Withdrawal without rupture, not abandonment. A completed chapter in a language that had never needed words. I left the stones as they were. I did not add to them. I did not move them to prove anything to anybody. That evening, I told Mom what I'd found while she shelled peas into a chipped bowl. She looked towards the window, where the extra placemat still sat, and said, "Then we were kept company as long as we needed it." "Feels that way," I said. She slid the bowl toward me. "Keep setting the place." "I will." Now, when someone tells me they feel alone in a way that makes their own house echo, I tell this story plain, not to win an argument, not to make a legend bigger than it is. I tell it because I know what the long winter silence can do to a man and a family when nobody names it. I tell it because I watched impossible scale move with patient courtesy, because my dog trusted what my fear could not, because my mother breathed easier in a house that no longer felt forgotten, and because grief did not leave me but learned to stand beside wonder without cancelling it. I still build fence. I still plough snow when county calls. I still miss my father in sudden stings when I reach for a wrench he once used. But I stay on this ridge now by choice, not collapse. I call my daughter back the same day. I answer my wife with care, even when a conversation is hard. I set a spring bundle under the cedar each year. No bait, no bargain, just thanks offered into a world wider than my old framework allowed. Some years flowers appear on Mom's step. Some years the step stays bare and the morning is beautiful anyway. The place by the window remains set for gratitude, and every time I pass it with a coffee mug in hand, I remember that gentleness can find a porch long before a person is ready to believe it.